August 7th, 45. 10:23 a.m., Tinian Island. The decryption room smelled of hot metal and nervous sweat. Cipher machines clattered in rhythmic bursts. Radio static hissed through wall-mounted speakers. Fans fought a losing battle against Pacific heat that turned the cramped space into a pressure cooker of concentration. Lieutenant Howard Mason had been monitoring Japanese military frequencies for 2 years. He knew the daily rhythm: morning logistics updates, midday position reports, evening supply requisitions, the architecture of a dying empire transmitted in code. Then the pattern shattered. A teletype machine in the corner erupted with urgent clicks. Mason's colleague tore the paper free, read the prefix, and went pale. General Staff Emergency Directive. Mason had seen 3 of these in 24 months. Each one had preceded major military action. He leaned over the decryption table as the cipher strips came together, letter by letter, revealing text that would later be described in Washington briefings as the most alarming indication Japan intended mass national sacrifice. The decoded lines appeared in careful typewritten columns. Total resistance preparation in all districts. Civilian volunteer units to be mobilized immediately. Prepare for decisive battle within the homeland. No surrender under any circumstance. Before we continue, tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing how these forgotten chapters of history reach new audiences. Mason read the final line twice, then a third time. Behind him, the room fell silent as he translated it aloud. Every analyst in the building had expected panic, perhaps surrender, maybe desperate pleas for negotiation. Instead, they held evidence of something far more chilling. Within the hour, the message reached Washington, where intelligence officials would spend the next week assembling a picture that defied all strategic predictions. Japan had been told an entire city vanished in a flash, and responded by ordering its population to prepare for extinction. This wasn't shock. It wasn't confusion. It was a window into a leadership prepared to let millions die before admitting defeat. 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the underground war room maintained its atmosphere of controlled crisis. Cool concrete walls, cigarette smoke hanging motionless in artificial light. Maps covered in red pins, tracking American advances that crept closer each day. War Minister General Korechika Anami had developed a habit of standing perfectly still when receiving bad news. It gave him time to think. On the morning of August 7th at 9 o'clock a.m., an aide delivered the first fragmentary reports from Hiroshima. Eyewitness accounts, railway officials, survivors who had walked through rubble. Their testimonies described a flash brighter than the sun, a blast that erased the city center, fires that consumed everything. Anami read them 3 times. His first thought: the Americans had finally launched their long-anticipated massive conventional raid. Perhaps 500 B-29 bombers dropping incendiaries in coordinated waves. The destruction made sense only in those terms. But the morning's reconnaissance reports told a different story. Weather observers had tracked only 3 American aircraft over Hiroshima. Not 300. 3. Chief of the General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu stood at the massive wall map tracking every known Allied bomber group in the Pacific. His intelligence staff had spent 3 years predicting American air operations with extraordinary accuracy. Formation sizes, ordnance patterns, expected damage radius. Nothing in 3 years of strategic bombing suggested 3 aircraft could destroy a city of 350,000 people. By midday, reconnaissance pilots attempting aerial assessment reported something unprecedented. A mushroom-shaped cloud towering over 40,000 feet, visible from distances that seemed impossible. Survivors spoke of buildings vaporized, shadows burned into stone, an entire urban center replaced by firestorm. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the most detailed eyewitness account at 1 o'clock p.m. A factory manager who had been 12 miles outside the city when the flash occurred. His testimony, recorded by Togo's assistant, described a pressure wave that knocked trains from their tracks, glass that melted in windows, people who simply ceased to exist. The Supreme War Council convened at 3 o'clock p.m. in near silence. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, who had barely survived an assassination attempt 3 months earlier for suggesting peace negotiations, placed the accumulated intelligence reports on the table. His hands shook slightly. Around that table sat the 6 men who would decide whether Japan acknowledged reality or ordered its people to fight until nothing remained. They chose denial. And American intelligence heard every word of what came next. The message Mason decoded didn't travel through diplomatic channels or neutral intermediaries. It moved through the air itself, electromagnetic pulses bouncing off the ionosphere, transmitted on frequencies the Japanese military believed were secure. They were wrong. By August 1945, the United States had constructed the most sophisticated signals intelligence network in human history. Listening posts stretched across the Pacific like an invisible web. Installations on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Radio intercept ships positioned off the Japanese coast. Massive antenna arrays in Hawaii that could pluck whispers from 4,000 miles away. Every station operated around the clock. Receivers scanning frequencies, operators wearing headphones for hours until their ears ached. Recording equipment running continuously. At any given moment, dozens of Japanese military transmissions were being captured, logged, and queued for decryption. The code breaking itself had been underway since early in the war. American cryptologists had systematically dismantled Japan's major cipher systems, military codes, diplomatic codes, naval codes. By 1945, there were few Japanese encrypted transmissions the U.S. couldn't eventually read. The challenge wasn't breaking the codes anymore. It was processing the sheer volume of intercepts fast enough to matter. The emergency directive that reached Mason's desk on August 7th had originated from the Japanese Army General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, around 3 a.m. local time. It was transmitted via high-frequency radio to regional commands across Japan, Kyushu, Honshu, Hokkaido, bouncing through relay stations to ensure every garrison received the same instructions simultaneously. U.S. intercept stations caught multiple copies of the same transmission as it propagated through Japan's communication network. By the time Mason began decrypting it, analysts in Hawaii were working on an identical message, and a Navy listening post aboard a submarine off the Japanese coast had recorded a third copy. This wasn't intercepted gossip or captured documents. This was an official, top-level military directive. The kind of order that moved entire armies, that reorganized national priorities, that changed the course of wars. In Washington, senior intelligence officials had spent the previous 24 hours in a state of cautious optimism. The Hiroshima bomb had exceeded every expectation. 1 aircraft, 1 bomb, a city functionally erased. Many in the War Department believed Japan's surrender was now inevitable, perhaps within days. The intercepted directive shattered that assumption with surgical precision. Japan wasn't preparing to surrender. Japan was preparing its population to die. Mason's decoded message reached the Pentagon by early afternoon East Coast time. Within an hour, it had been briefed to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who reportedly read it twice before sitting down heavily in his chair. By evening, President Truman had been informed. The first verified Japanese response to Hiroshima was not capitulation, but a command for total resistance. The psychological impact on Allied leadership was immediate and profound. If an atomic bomb, a weapon of unprecedented destruction, couldn't force Japan's military to acknowledge reality, what would? How many more cities would need to vanish? How many more hundreds of thousands would die? But the August 7th message was only the beginning. Over the following days, U.S. intelligence would intercept a cascading series of communications that painted an increasingly dark picture of Japan's intentions. Orders to mobilize civilian defense units, instructions for training women and teenagers in combat, directives to prepare suicide squads for every coastal approach, commands to destroy food stockpiles rather than let them fall into Allied hands. Each decoded message was more chilling than the last. Each one confirmed that Japan's leadership had moved beyond rational calculation into something else entirely. A willingness to sacrifice everything rather than accept the inevitable. For U.S. intelligence, one message was disturbing. What came next was terrifying. The concrete bunker 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace maintained its artificial coolness even as Tokyo sweltered above. Ventilation fans hummed constantly. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across wall-mounted maps where red pins tracked American advances like a spreading infection. The air tasted of cigarette smoke, stale coffee, and something harder to name: the metallic edge of desperation. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki entered the war room at 8:30 a.m. on August 7th, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had survived an assassin's bullets 3 months earlier. At 77, he understood that even suggesting peace negotiations could mean death. War Minister General Korachika Anami stood at the central table, reading through fragmentary reports that had arrived throughout the night. His expression revealed nothing. Beside him, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo chain-smoked American cigarettes someone had confiscated years ago, each drag punctuated by a small cough. Chief of the General Staff Yoshijiro Umezu arrived last, carrying a folder thick with decoded transmissions and eyewitness accounts. He placed them on the table without ceremony. "Hiroshima," he said simply. An aide began reading testimonies aloud. Railway workers who'd been 15 miles outside the city, factory managers, telegraph operators, police officers. Their accounts shared an impossible consistency. A flash like 1,000 suns. The entire city center vanished in an instant. Buildings turned to dust. People turned to shadows. A cloud rose higher than mountains, shaped like a mushroom, glowing with colors we've never seen. The room absorbed this in silence. Anami spoke first, his voice carefully measured. The Americans have launched their largest conventional raid. Possibly 500 B-29 bombers carrying incendiaries, coordinated for maximum effect. Several officers nodded. The mathematics made sense. Hiroshima covered 27 square miles. To destroy it completely would require unprecedented bombing density, but the Americans had the industrial capacity. They demonstrated it over Tokyo, over Osaka, over dozens of Japanese cities. Then Togo dropped the detail that cracked their logic. Weather reconnaissance tracked 3 aircraft over Hiroshima. Not 300. 3. The silence that followed had weight. 4,000 miles east, in Washington, intelligence analysts were reaching the opposite conclusion with the same evidence. The decoded emergency directive sat on a desk in the Pentagon, its implications spreading through military leadership like a slow poison. Japan had been told a city vanished. They'd responded by ordering national mobilization for final battle. Secretary of War Stimson stared at the translation, then at the maps showing estimated casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The projections ranged from 500,000 to over 1 million Allied casualties. Japanese casualties could reach 10 million or more. The intercepted message suggested Japan's leadership was willing to accept those numbers. Back in Tokyo's underground chamber, the Supreme War Council struggled with impossible arithmetic. 3 aircraft couldn't destroy a city. Therefore, the reports must be exaggerated. Or, the Americans had developed some new type of incendiary cluster bomb. Or, survivors were mistaken about aircraft numbers. Admiral Suemu Toyoda proposed what became the official interpretation: a special type of incendiary attack. Conventional weapons deployed with unprecedented coordination. Umezu added the critical caveat: we must assume this can be repeated on other cities. The logical leap was small. The consequences were enormous. If the Americans had developed a new conventional bombing technique, however devastating, it changed nothing strategically. Japan had already survived months of firebombing. Cities had burned before. The population had endured. Anami's voice cut through the discussion. We proceed as planned. Total resistance. Every district mobilized. If the Americans can destroy cities, we make every city a fortress, every citizen a soldier. Suzuki, who understood exactly where this logic led, said nothing. By 3 p.m., the emergency directive was being transmitted to regional commands across Japan. The same message American cryptologists were decoding on Tinian. The order that would convince Washington that Japan intended to fight literally to extinction. The decision wasn't made from ignorance. It was made from refusal, a collective choice to believe what they needed to believe rather than accept what the evidence showed. In the war room's artificial light, surrounded by maps tracking their nation's collapse, Japan's military leadership convinced themselves that spirit could overcome reality. 72 hours later, Nagasaki would prove them wrong. But by then, the orders would already be in motion. The follow-up messages arrived over the next 48 hours like pieces of a nightmare assembling itself. On August 8th, Lieutenant Mason decoded a directive from the Home Ministry to regional governors. It outlined the formation of volunteer combat units, civilian defense forces to be organized block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, across every city and town in Japan. The age range, 15 to 60 for men, 17 to 40 for women. Training would begin immediately. Bamboo spears, sharpened farming tools, improvised explosives fashioned from whatever materials could be scavenged. The directive specified that each unit should prepare close-quarters suicide attacks against landing forces. Mason read the document twice, then called over his supervisor. They stared at the translation together. They're going to arm grandmothers, his supervisor said quietly. The next intercept detailed conscription orders for teenage boys. 15-year-olds would be inducted into the military reserves and assigned to coastal defense positions. 16 and 17-year-olds would receive accelerated infantry training. The orders specified that these youth units were expected to conduct sacrificial delaying actions against American advances. In plain language, human shields. By August 9th, U.S. intelligence had intercepted communications outlining beach defense plans. Suicide boats packed with explosives. Kamikaze aircraft held in reserve. Soldiers equipped with explosive charges strapped to poles, trained to throw themselves under advancing tanks. Every approach to every Japanese city would be a killing ground, not just for American soldiers, but for the Japanese civilians being ordered to defend them. Then came the infrastructure directives. Communications from the Japanese Army Logistics Command ordered the systematic destruction of food supplies in any region likely to fall under Allied control. Rice stores, grain silos, fishing fleets. The policy was explicit: deny resources to the enemy, even if it meant condemning the local population to starvation. Railway officials received instructions to prepare demolition charges on every major bridge and tunnel. If invasion came, Japan's transportation network would be rendered useless, making it impossible to move food to civilian populations. The implications were staggering. Japan's leadership wasn't just planning military resistance. They were engineering conditions for mass civilian death. Whether by combat, starvation, or both. In Washington, these intercepts landed on desks already covered with Operation Downfall planning documents. The two-phase invasion of Japan, scheduled to begin November 1st, 1945. Operation Olympic would hit Kyushu with 14 divisions. Operation Coronet would assault Honshu near Tokyo with 25 divisions. Conservative estimates projected 500,000 American casualties. Japanese military casualties could reach 5 million. Civilian casualties were impossible to calculate. But planners suspected they could exceed 10 million. Those projections had been made assuming normal warfare. The intercepted messages suggested something far worse. Colonel Sidney Mashbear, chief of Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, assembled the decoded directives into a briefing document for General MacArthur. His summary was blunt. Japanese leadership has concluded that mass civilian sacrifice is preferable to surrender. Every man, woman, and child is being positioned as an expendable asset. Invasion casualties, both Allied and Japanese, will exceed all previous projections. On Tinian, Mason and his colleagues worked in shifts, processing the endless stream of intercepts. Each new message painted a darker picture. Late on August 9th, Mason decoded orders for special attack units composed of civilians who would don military uniforms and conduct false surrender operations, approaching American forces with white flags before detonating concealed explosives. He thought about the teenagers being trained to throw themselves under tanks, the mothers being handed bamboo spears, the elderly men being told that dying for the emperor was their final duty. Behind every line of decoded text were real people. Families in Osaka, school children in Nagoya, farmers in Hokkaido, all being prepared not to survive the war, but to die in it as slowly and expensively as possible. The strategy had a terrible logic. Make invasion so costly in American lives that the United States would negotiate rather than conquer. Make every city a Stalingrad. Make every home a fortress. But the cost would be measured in millions of Japanese civilians who had no choice in the matter. Mason finished translating the latest directive, instructions for organizing suicide squads from hospital patients and factory workers, and set down his pencil. For U.S. intelligence, the picture was now complete. Japan wasn't preparing to lose the war. August 9th, 1945. 11:02 a.m. The second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki with the same terrible physics as the first. A flash that turned the sky white. A fireball that reached 7,000 degrees. A pressure wave that flattened buildings in a 2-mile radius. The mushroom cloud rose 60,000 feet, visible from islands 150 miles away. Within minutes, 40,000 people were dead. By day's end, that number would double. On Tinian, U.S. intelligence operators returned to their receivers, waiting for Japan's response. After Hiroshima, the intercepted message had arrived within 24 hours, a directive for total resistance. After Nagasaki, analysts expected something different. Perhaps surrender, perhaps at least acknowledgement of the impossible situation Japan now faced. The transmission came through at 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time. Mason decoded it in under 20 minutes. The message was brief, official. transmitted from Japanese Army General Staff to all regional commands. All units maintain fighting spirit. Nation must endure further sacrifice. That was all. No mention of casualties, no reference to the second bomb, no hint of reconsideration. Mason stared at the decoded text, then looked at his supervisor. They're not going to stop. His supervisor said nothing. There was nothing to say. In Washington, the reaction was more visceral. Senior military officials had expected, hoped, that a second atomic demonstration would break Japan's will. Instead, they faced confirmation of what the previous intercepts had suggested. Japan's military leadership was operating beyond rational calculation. But August 9th delivered a second shock that changed everything. At midnight Moscow time, just hours after Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the border in a coordinated assault that shattered Japan's Kwantung Army within days. For Japan's leadership, this was the final betrayal. Throughout the war, Tokyo had maintained desperate hope that Moscow might serve as a neutral intermediary, helping negotiate peace terms that would preserve some measure of Japanese sovereignty. Foreign Minister Togo had spent months attempting to open diplomatic channels through Soviet contacts. Now that hope evaporated. In the underground war room beneath the Imperial Palace, the Supreme War Council convened an emergency session at 3:00 a.m. on August 10th. The maps on the walls now showed catastrophe from two directions: American atomic bombs from the Pacific, Soviet armies from the mainland. Prime Minister Suzuki laid out the situation with exhausted clarity. We face annihilation by nuclear weapons or conquest by Soviet forces, perhaps both. War Minister Anami responded with the same resolve he'd shown after Hiroshima. Then we fight on both fronts. The Homeland Defense Plan accounts for simultaneous threats. One decisive battle on Japanese soil. We'll force the Americans to negotiate. Foreign Minister Togo's voice cracked as he spoke. There will be no negotiation. There will be no homeland left to defend. The division was absolute. Half the council pushed for immediate surrender. Half insisted on fighting to the end. Hours passed without resolution. On Tinian, Mason and his team continued intercepting Japanese military communications. The messages revealed no panic, no collapse of command structure. Instead, they showed Japanese units being repositioned for homeland defense, coastal fortifications being reinforced, civilian mobilization orders being distributed. Even facing nuclear annihilation from the sky and Soviet invasion from the north, Japan's military apparatus continued preparing for final battle. Colonel Mashbeer compiled the latest intercepts into a briefing for General MacArthur. Japanese High Command shows no indication of imminent surrender despite atomic bombings and Soviet entry. Military leadership remains committed to homeland defense strategy. Civilian population being positioned for mass sacrifice operations. The intercepts had become more than intelligence. They were a psychological profile of an enemy willing to let everything burn rather than accept defeat. In Washington, Secretary of War Stimson confronted a grim reality. The atomic bomb, the weapon supposed to shock Japan into surrender, had failed to break the military's resolve. 2 cities vaporized. Hundreds of thousands dead. A new enemy invading from the north. And still, the intercepted messages showed no wavering. The Japanese military leadership wasn't ignoring the evidence. They were choosing ideology over survival. For the Allies, one truth became inescapable. Atomic weapons alone would not end this war. Something else would have to break, 6 men sat around a table 90 feet underground, holding the fate of 70 million people in their hands. The Supreme War Council, Japan's innermost decision-making body, had been meeting. Continuous session since August 9th. 36 hours of debate. Endless cigarettes. Cold tea. The same arguments circling back on themselves like a serpent eating its tail. 3 members advocated immediate acceptance of Allied surrender terms. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai. They saw the mathematics clearly. 2 atomic bombs. Soviet invasion. American industrial supremacy. Continued resistance meant national extinction. 3 members demanded Japan fight on. War Minister General Korachika Anami, Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, and Navy Chief of Staff Soemu Toyoda. They spoke of honor, of spirit, of forcing the Americans to negotiate rather than dictate terms. One final decisive battle on Japanese soil could make invasions so costly that Washington would compromise. The vote remained deadlocked, 3-3. While Tokyo's leadership argued in circles, American intelligence continued intercepting the orders that flowed from their indecision. On August 10th at 4:30 a.m., Mason decoded instructions from the Home Ministry. Civilian defense units in coastal regions would begin constructing cave fortifications. Women and children would be taught to attack landing forces with farm implements and Molotov cocktails. At 9:15 a.m., another message. Army depots would distribute remaining weapons to civilian volunteers. Priority given to major cities expected to become battlegrounds. At 2:00 p.m., a logistics directive. Food supplies in southern Kyushu would be moved inland to prevent capture. Local populations would manage with reduced rations. Each intercept was transmitted to Washington within hours, where they became ammunition in a different kind of debate. General George Marshall briefed President Truman on the latest intelligence. Japanese military continues full-scale preparation for homeland defense. No indication of command structure breakdown or imminent capitulation. Invasion casualties remain projected at 500,000 American, estimated 5 to 10 million Japanese. The intercepted messages weren't hypothetical warnings. They were real orders, being executed in real time, preparing real people to die. Back in the underground war room, Foreign Minister Togo's voice had gone hoarse from hours of pleading. The Americans have demonstrated they can destroy our cities at will. The Soviets have eliminated our Manchurian defenses in 5 days. We have no allies, no resources, no realistic path to victory. Continued resistance is national suicide. War Minister Anami responded with steel in his voice. Surrender without guaranteeing the Emperor's safety is equally suicidal to the soul of Japan. The Americans may demand his abdication, his trial, his execution. We cannot accept terms that destroy our national identity. There will be no national identity left to preserve, Togo shot back. Better to die with honor than live with shame. Prime Minister Suzuki, who had spent 50 years in military service before becoming a reluctant advocate for peace, closed his eyes. He understood both sides. The military's code of honor was genuine, deeply embedded in Japanese culture and military tradition. But so was the approaching catastrophe. The impasse was complete. Constitutional tradition required unanimous agreement from the Supreme War Council. With the vote split 3-3, Japan remained paralyzed, unable to surrender, unable to effectively continue the war. Hours became days. The debates repeated themselves. Meanwhile, American B-29s continued conventional bombing raids. Soviet forces advanced deeper into Manchuria. Intercepted Japanese messages confirmed that civilian mobilization was accelerating, that beach defenses were being reinforced, that the machinery of national suicide was grinding forward. On Tinian, Mason decoded a message from Japanese Imperial headquarters at 11 p.m. on August 13th. It ordered all commands to maintain absolute combat readiness and prepare for the decisive battle that will determine our nation's survival. He filed it with dozens of similar intercepts, each one confirming what Washington already knew. Japan's military leadership remained committed to fighting to extinction. Inside the Pentagon, strategic planners updated invasion timetables. Operation Olympic was scheduled for November 1st, less than 3 months away. If Japan's surrender didn't come soon, millions would die in an invasion whose horrors both sides could clearly foresee. In Tokyo, as dawn broke on August 14th, Suzuki finally acknowledged what everyone in the room understood, but no one wanted to say aloud. The Supreme War Council could not break its own deadlock. There was only one person in Japan who could override their division, who possessed the constitutional authority to force a decision that half the military leadership opposed. But asking the emperor to intervene would shatter centuries of tradition. The emperor did not make policy. He endorsed it. Yet if he didn't act, there would be no Japan left to preserve tradition for. Suzuki sent word to the imperial palace. The decision would move to someone who had never been asked to make one before. In 2,600 years of imperial tradition, the emperor had never been asked to break a political deadlock. Prime Minister Suzuki's request shattered precedent with a single sentence. Your Majesty's intervention is required to save the nation. Emperor Hirohito received the request in silence. At 44 years old, he had reigned for 2 decades without making a single policy decision. His role was ceremonial, symbolic, to embody Japan's continuity, not to direct its course. Military leaders made strategy. The cabinet made policy. The emperor sanctified their decisions with his presence. But there were no decisions left to sanctify, only catastrophe. The briefing came at 10 p.m. on August 13th, delivered in the Imperial Palace's underground conference room. Military aides presented the accumulated evidence with clinical precision. Hiroshima, 70,000 dead, possibly more. City center obliterated. Nagasaki, 40,000 dead immediately. Casualties still mounting. Soviet invasion. Kwantung army collapsing. Hundreds of thousands captured or killed. The aides then presented something more disturbing. Summaries of Japan's own military directives. Orders for civilian mobilization. Plans for nationwide suicide defense. Instructions to destroy food supplies. The blueprint for national extinction, transmitted through official channels, intercepted by American intelligence. Hirohito read the translated intercepts in silence. These were his military's orders, commands issued in the name of preserving his throne, his honor, his divine status. They described a Japan that would cease to exist. Casualty projections for invasion: 5 to 10 million Japanese dead. Perhaps more. The American estimates matched Japan's own internal calculations, which sat in a folder marked "Top Secret" on the table before him. His military leaders had been willing to accept those numbers. They had been preparing the population to die rather than surrender. At 11:50 p.m., the Supreme War Council convened in the underground shelter for what would be their final session. The concrete walls absorbed sound, making every voice seem smaller than it was. War Minister Anami spoke first, his conviction undiminished. The Americans will negotiate if we make invasion costly enough. One decisive homeland battle, fought with the spirit of our entire population, can force honorable terms. We must guarantee the Emperor's safety, preserve our sovereignty, conduct our own war crimes trials, oversee our own disarmament. Anami believed every word. For him, surrender without conditions meant cultural annihilation, the destruction of everything that made Japan Japanese. Chief of Staff Umezu reinforced the argument. Our soldiers are prepared. Our civilians are ready. The Americans have never faced an enemy willing to sacrifice everything. They will negotiate. Foreign Minister Togo responded with exhausted precision. The Americans have atomic bombs. They have demonstrated willingness to use them. They have industrial capacity we cannot match. The Soviets have opened a second front we cannot defend. There will be no negotiation. There will only be the total destruction of our nation and people. The arguments continued for an hour, covering ground worn smooth by days of repetition. Then Emperor Hirohito spoke. His voice was quiet, high-pitched, formal, the voice of someone unused to commanding rooms. But every word carried absolute weight. I have listened carefully to all arguments. I have examined the military situation. I have considered the intelligence regarding our defensive preparations and enemy capabilities. He paused, letting the silence settle. To continue this war is to witness the complete destruction of the Japanese people and the obliteration of human civilization itself. I cannot bear to see my people suffer any longer. The room held its breath. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The time has come to bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable. I order acceptance of the Allied terms, provided our national polity is maintained. In plain language, surrender, with one condition, that the Emperor himself not be abolished. War Minister Anami's face showed nothing, but those who knew him saw the fracture in his composure. He had devoted his life to preventing this moment. He had genuinely believed one more battle could change the outcome. Prime Minister Suzuki felt decades of military service and political survival crystallize into this single moment of relief. The war would end. His people would survive. Navy Minister Yonai quietly wept. Emperor Hirohito stood, formally ending the meeting. His decision was final, absolute, unprecedented. 4,000 miles away, American intelligence had no knowledge of what had just occurred. They continued intercepting military communications, showing defensive preparations, civilian mobilization, ongoing resistance planning. The messages would continue for another 24 hours, until Japan's surrender was broadcast to the world. But in that underground room beneath the Imperial Palace, the decision that would end World War II had already been made. The intercepted messages that had so alarmed Washington, the brutal directives for mass sacrifice, had served their purpose in ways Japan's military never intended. They had proven to everyone, including the Emperor himself, exactly how far his government was willing to go. And in that proof, Hirohito found the resolve to say, no further. August 14th, 1945, 10:00 p.m. In a sparse barracks room near Tokyo, Major Kenji Hatanaka sat with a dozen young officers and spoke words that would nearly restart the war. The Emperor has been deceived by cowards. The surrender order is a betrayal orchestrated by weak men who fear death more than dishonor. If we act tonight, we can save Japan. Hatanaka was 34 years old, a product of military academies that taught death before defeat, spirit over material reality. He and his co-conspirators, mostly in their 20s and 30s, had spent their entire adult lives in a military culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate shame. The plan was simple and desperate. Seize the Imperial Palace, locate the phonograph recording of the Emperor's surrender address, scheduled to broadcast at noon the next day, destroy it, and isolate the emperor from the treasonous advisors pushing for capitulation. Without the recording, the surrender could not be announced. The war would continue. By midnight, they were moving. At 12:30 a.m. on August 15th, U.S. signals intelligence stations across the Pacific detected something unusual. Radio traffic from Tokyo had shifted. Normally, routine military communications were replaced by terse, encrypted bursts. Troop, movement orders, emergency frequencies activated. On Tinian, Mason's overnight replacement flagged the anomaly. The pattern didn't match standard defensive preparations or administrative communications. Something was happening in Tokyo, something urgent and unplanned, but the Americans couldn't decode it fast enough to understand what. Major Hatanaka and his conspirators arrived at the Imperial Palace grounds at 1:00 a.m. They carried falsified orders claiming authorization from War Minister Anami and Eastern District Army Commander General Shizuichi Tanaka. The palace guards, trained to obey military authority without question, allowed them entry. Within minutes, the conspirators controlled the main gates and several key buildings. Hatanaka's first objective: find Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori, commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, and secure his cooperation. The entire coup depended on the Guards Division joining the rebellion. They found Mori in his office, reviewing the Emperor's surrender decision with quiet resignation. Hatanaka demanded Mori issue orders for the Guards Division to support the coup. Mori refused. "The Emperor has spoken. Our duty is obedience." The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. Then Hatanaka shot him. With Mori dead, the conspirators forged orders in his name, commanding guards units to seal the palace and search for the recording. Soldiers fanned out through dark corridors, searching office by office, room by room. Palace staff, realizing what was happening, hid the recording in an unlikely location. Among stacks of documents in the court ladies' quarters, a place male soldiers were culturally forbidden from thoroughly searching. The search continued for hours. Hatanaka interrogated palace officials. Conspirators ransacked offices, overturned furniture, opened every safe they could find. They never found the recording. By 3:00 a.m., cracks appeared in the coup's foundation. General Tanaka, the Eastern District Army Commander, whose authority the conspirators had falsely invoked, arrived at the palace and immediately denounced the rebellion. He ordered guards units to stand down and began systematically retaking control of the grounds. Other senior officers, initially uncertain, sided with Tanaka. The conspiracy had depended on widespread military support that never materialized. Most officers, however disillusioned with surrender, understood that defying the Emperor's explicit command was unthinkable. Without broader support, the coup collapsed into chaos. Some conspirators fled. Others barricaded themselves in occupied buildings. A few prepared to fight to the death. Major Hatanaka, realizing his failure, walked out of the palace grounds at dawn. At 5:00 a.m., in a plaza outside the Imperial Palace, he shot himself. His last words, spoken to a fellow conspirator: "I have failed Japan." By 6:00 a.m., the palace was secure. The recording, hidden throughout the night in a stack of paperwork, was retrieved and prepared for broadcast. U.S. intelligence would spend the next 24 hours piecing together what had happened from intercepted communications and fragmentary reports. The full details wouldn't emerge until after the occupation began. But the implications were staggering. For approximately 5 hours, the end of World War II hung on whether a handful of conspirators could find a single phonograph record in a dark palace. If they had succeeded, If the recording had been destroyed, if the Guards Division had joined the rebellion, if senior commanders had wavered, Japan's surrender might have been delayed by weeks or months. The atomic bombs would have continued. The Soviet invasion would have advanced. Operation Downfall would have proceeded toward its horrific conclusion. Millions more would have died. Instead, at noon on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across radio speakers throughout Japan, announcing what the intercepted messages had suggested was impossible. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Japan was surrendering. The brutal messages that had convinced Washington of Japan's determination to fight to extinction had been real. But so was the fragile thread by which peace had finally come. September 1945, Tokyo. Lieutenant Howard Mason walked through the ruins of the Japanese War Ministry building carrying a briefcase full of decoded intercepts. Around him, American occupation forces were beginning the massive task of cataloging Japan's wartime archives. Thousands of documents, orders, intelligence assessments, and strategic plans. Mason's assignment was specific. Compare the messages he'd intercepted and decoded with the original Japanese records. Verify what American intelligence had been reading was authentic, accurate, complete. What he found was worse than he'd imagined. The intercepts were real. Every directive for civilian mobilization, every order for suicide defense, every command to destroy food supplies rather than surrender. All of it existed in multiple copies across Japan's military bureaucracy. Stamped, filed, distributed to regional commands. But the archives revealed something more disturbing. Japan's own intelligence assessments, classified reports prepared by their most senior analysts, had accurately calculated American industrial capacity, invasion timelines, and the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory. Documents dated as early as 1944 concluded that continued war would result in national destruction. The Japanese leadership had known. They had understood the strategic reality with painful clarity. Their intelligence was sound. Their calculations were correct. They had simply chosen to ignore them. Mason found a folder marked Operation Ketsugo, Japan's official Homeland Defense Plan. Inside were casualty projections that matched American estimates almost exactly. 20 million Japanese civilian deaths if invasion occurred. Starvation, disease, combat. The numbers were comprehensive and terrifyingly precise. These weren't Allied propaganda. This was Japan's own military planning staff acknowledging what their orders would cost. And they had issued those orders anyway. He sat in the ruined building, surrounded by filing cabinets full of evidence, and pulled out the first intercept he'd decoded on August 7th. The message that had arrived less than 24 hours after Hiroshima. Total resistance preparation in all districts. Civilian volunteer units to be mobilized immediately. Prepare for decisive battle within the homeland. No surrender under any circumstance. When he'd first translated those words, he'd thought it was denial, a military leadership unable to process what had happened. Now he understood it was something darker. A conscious choice to sacrifice millions rather than accept the unbearable reality of defeat. The post-war investigations would take years. War crimes trials, interviews with surviving leaders, analysis of thousands of documents. The picture that emerged reshaped how historians understood the war's final days. The atomic bombs were devastating. Cities erased, hundreds of thousands killed instantly or slowly through radiation. The technology was apocalyptic. But the true horror lay not in the weapon itself, but in what the intercepted messages revealed about human decision-making under ideological certainty. Leaders who valued honor over survival. Commanders who ordered teenagers to die for strategic positions that no longer mattered. Officials who planned to starve their own population rather than surrender it intact. The brutality wasn't in the flash of nuclear fire. It was in the willingness to continue long after any rational hope remained. Mason returned to the United States in December 1945. He would spend the rest of his career in signals intelligence, eventually rising to senior positions in what would become the National Security Agency. He never spoke publicly about the intercepts. The work remained classified for decades. But he kept a folder, copies of the messages he'd decoded that August. Sometimes, late at night, he would read them again and think about the lives represented by each line. The Japanese families who would have died in the invasion that never happened. The American soldiers who would have stormed beaches prepared with suicide squads and civilian shields. The fragile nature of the peace that finally came. Today, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial stands where the city center once existed. Tourists walk through museums displaying photographs, artifacts, survivor testimonies. The exhibits focus primarily on the bomb itself, its physics, its devastation, its historical significance. Fewer visitors know about the intercepted messages. Fewer still understand what they revealed. In Washington's National Archives, the decoded intercepts sit in temperature-controlled storage. Thousands of pages, each transmission a window into those 9 days when the world teetered between peace and apocalypse. The messages documented something more terrifying than atomic weapons: the human capacity for self-destruction. When ideology overrides evidence, when honor becomes more valuable than survival, when leaders convince themselves that spirit can overcome reality. When U.S. intelligence finally laid the real Japanese messages side by side, the intercepts, the War Ministry records, the internal assessments, one truth became impossible to ignore. The most brutal lines were not about the bomb itself. They were about how far leaders were willing to go before stopping the war, and how many millions of lives hung on the thread of one man finally saying, "No further." The Emperor's voice crackling over radio speakers at noon on August 15th didn't just announce surrender. It stopped a countdown to national extinction that Japan's own military had set in motion. The intercepted message after Hiroshima was real. Its contents were brutal beyond belief, and understanding what it meant, what it truly revealed about human nature and the cost of ideology, remains essential to ensuring it never happens again. Hello, my beautiful family. If you're listening to this story, please do me a favor and subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second, but means the world to me. Also, comment where you're watching from below.